It was a peculiarly bright spring morning in the village of St. Mary Mead, the sort of morning when the air held just a touch of crispness from the lingering chill of winter, yet the promise of warmth hovered about the garden hedges and budding lilacs. Miss Jane Marple, who had lived long enough to recognize that spring was always accompanied by both delight and deception, sat by her parlor window with her embroidery resting idly upon her lap. She had been watching the comings and goings of her neighbors with her customary quiet attention, though she would have been the first to assure anyone that she was not in the least curious about other people's affairs. It was, she always insisted, mere observation, a lifelong habit of taking note of the ordinary, and more importantly, the irregular. That very morning, the post had brought her a most intriguing letter. It was written in a fine sloping hand, scented faintly with lavender, and bore the crest of a local hotel in Much Haddam, a market town not far from St. Mary Mead. The name of the hotel, the Grange Retreat, was printed elegantly at the top. The invitation was unexpected, for Miss Marple was not in the habit of receiving correspondence from fashionable establishments. The letter was from Mrs. Lavinia Price, an old acquaintance whom Miss Marple had known in her youth. Mrs. Price wrote that she had recently taken residence at the Grange Retreat, a new establishment set in the Hertfordshire countryside, advertised as place of repose, renewal, and natural vitality. It had been recommended to her by her physician for the nerves, she explained. She invited Miss Marple to spend a week there as her guest, adding in a postscript, "My dear Jane, I know you dislike traveling these days, but I should be very glad of your company. The place is unusual, most unusual, and I should value your clear eyes. Things here are not quite what they seem. You always had a knack for seeing through appearances, did you not?" Miss Marple, though cautious by nature, was struck by the curious tone of the postscript. She was fond of Mrs. Price, who had been a friend of her late cousin, and besides, one could not help but feel a twinge of curiosity at the description. A hotel where things were not quite what they seemed. Well, such phrasing practically demanded a closer look. 3 days later, with her small carpet bag packed, and her neat hat tied firmly under her chin, Miss Marple found herself being conveyed along a winding country road in a hired motorcar, towards the ivy-draped facade of the Grange Retreat. The building was an old manor house converted into a hotel, its stonework mellowed by centuries, its windows sparkling in the spring sunlight. A row of topiary shrubs lined the entrance drive, clipped into curious shapes that seemed almost like figures bowing in welcome. Upon arrival, Miss Marple was ushered inside by a brisk maid in a smart uniform. The interior was pleasantly old-fashioned polished oak paneling, a sweeping staircase with a carved banister, and brass sconces casting a golden glow upon the hall. Yet, amid the air of antiquity, there was something faintly modern in the atmosphere, a suggestion of newness, perhaps in the arrangement of the lounge furniture, the freshly papered walls, and the faint medicinal tang that lingered beneath the scent of beeswax polish. Mrs. Lavinia Price received her with warm enthusiasm. She was a stout, florid lady in her late 60s, yet she looked unusually refreshed. "Jane, my dear, how good of you to come," she exclaimed, pressing Miss Marple's hand. "You'll find this place extraordinary, quite extraordinary. Why, only look at me! Don't I appear years younger than when you saw me last?" Indeed, Mrs. Price's cheeks were plumper, her eyes brighter, her step quicker than Miss Marple remembered. There was a curious glow about her, as if she had been granted a new lease on life. Miss Marple, concealing her surprise, responded with gentle civility. "You are looking very well indeed, Lavinia. Quite rejuvenated." Yes, that's just it," Mrs. Price beamed. "The Grange has that effect on one. Everyone says so. People come here feeling quite worn out, and in no time they appear positively, well, youthful. It is the talk of the county." As Miss Marple was introduced to the other guests over tea in the lounge, she noticed the same effect upon several of them. There was Colonel Arbuthnot, a retired officer of 70, whose moustache bristled with renewed vigor, and whose gait had the spring of a man 20 years younger. Lady Cynthia Harwood, once notorious in society for her sharp tongue, looked as though her wrinkles had been smoothed by some invisible hand, her voice lighter and more musical than Miss Marple recalled from a decade ago. The most striking case was that of Mr. Edmund Wells, a thin, scholarly man in his 50s, whose hair, Mrs. Price whispered, had lately darkened from grey to brown. He sat in a corner, absorbed in a book, yet his posture was upright and alert, his eyes gleaming with youthful intensity. Miss Marple, for all her gentle manners, was not a woman easily impressed by miracles of rejuvenation. Nature does not usually reverse her steps, she reflected inwardly. At least, not without considerable trickery. It was not long before she was introduced to the manager of the establishment, a tall, suave gentleman named Mr. Felix Ashworth. His manner was courteous, his smile warm, yet Miss Marple thought she detected something guarded in his eyes, as though he were perpetually on his guard against being found out. He spoke at length of the Grange's philosophy of health, restful surroundings, simple wholesome fare, mineral waters drawn from the local spring, and a program of gentle exercise and massage. The secret, Miss Marple, he declared, is the natural balance between body and spirit. Our guests leave feeling renewed, and often appearing years younger. Miss Marple inclined her head politely, though she could not help but notice that his explanation was rather vague. It was that evening, during supper, that the atmosphere of tranquility was disturbed. The guests had gathered in the dining hall, a room of high ceilings and chandeliers, where a fire crackled merrily on the hearth. They had just been served a delicate consommé, when a sudden commotion arose at the far end of the table. Mr. Edmund Wells, the scholarly gentleman, gave a strangled gasp, clutched at his throat, and collapsed forward onto his plate. Lady Cynthia let out a piercing cry, and Colonel Arbuthnot sprang to his feet. The butler and Mr. Ashworth hurried forward, but it was too late. Mr. Wells was dead. There was an immediate stir of alarm and confusion. Mrs. Price dabbed at her temples with her napkin, pale with shock. "Oh, heavens! Not here, not at the Grange," she murmured. Mr. Ashworth, his composure unshaken, ordered the staff to clear the room and escort the ladies to the lounge. The local doctor was summoned, but by the time he arrived, there was no doubt as to the outcome. Mr. Wells had perished suddenly, without warning. The doctor, after a brief examination, suggested heart failure. Yet Miss Marple, who had quietly observed the incident from her place at table, did not entirely agree. She had seen the sudden stiffening of his body, the desperate clutch at his throat. It bore the unmistakable signs of poisoning. As the guests whispered nervously in the lounge, Miss Marple sat very still in her armchair, her knitting lying untouched upon her lap. In her mind, the words of Mrs. Price's letter echoed. "Things here are not quite what they seem." It appeared she had walked into precisely the sort of puzzle she had been invited to solve. And as she watched the flickering shadows of the firelight play upon the anxious faces around her, she knew with quiet certainty that this peaceful hotel, famed for making its guests grow younger, had now become the scene of a most sinister crime. The death of Mr. Edmund Wells cast a pall over the Grange retreat. The once cheerful dining room was hushed, and the laughter that had echoed in its panelled halls earlier that evening seemed an intrusion upon the sombre mood now. Guests gathered in little groups in the lounge, whispering with furtive glances, as if afraid the walls themselves might overhear. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, appeared absorbed in the slow rhythm of her needles, but her keen blue eyes missed nothing. The local constable arrived the following morning, accompanied by Inspector Graves, a stout, no-nonsense man with a neatly trimmed moustache, and a slightly harassed air. He listened gravely to the accounts of those present, and examined the body. Though he admitted that sudden heart failure was possible, he was uneasy. "There's something odd about it," he confided to the doctor in a low voice. "I don't like the look of those convulsions. Still, without evidence, we cannot assume foul play." Felix Ashworth, the manager, insisted upon discretion. "The Grange has a reputation to uphold, Inspector," he said, his voice silky. "Our guests come here for rest, not scandal. We must avoid alarming them unnecessarily." Miss Marple noticed the way his hand tightened upon the back of a chair as he spoke. A man accustomed to control, she thought, and most anxious not to lose it. The inspector conducted preliminary interviews with the principal guests, and Miss Marple, in her quiet fashion, took mental notes. The guests under suspicion. Colonel Arbuthnot was the first to be questioned. A red-faced bluff man, he declared indignantly that he had scarcely spoken to Wells beyond polite remarks. "Scholarly sort of fellow," he said, "always scribbling in notebooks. Can't imagine anyone wanting to do him in. Damned shame, though. Damned shame." His distress seemed genuine, though Miss Marple observed that his hand trembled slightly as he lit his pipe. Lady Cynthia Harwood, still pale from the shock, was voluble in her account. "So sudden, Inspector. One moment he was perfectly well, the next, gone. But he was not a man without enemies, I dare say. Intellectuals seldom are. Always poking into matters best left alone." She fluttered her hands dramatically, though Miss Marple noted the sharp glint of calculation in her eyes. Mrs. Lavinia Price declared she had been very fond of Mr. Wells. He was a most agreeable conversationalist, she said earnestly, though I did sometimes think he looked rather anxious of late, as though something weighed on his mind. The most curious of the guests was Dr. Lionel Blackwood, a lean, intense man in his 40s, who had introduced himself the previous day as a physician taking a short rest cure. He gave his account briefly and precisely, with a clinical detachment that struck Miss Marple as unusual. He had, he said, never suspected Wells of illness. His constitution seemed sound. I was most surprised at his sudden demise. His eyes flickered when he spoke of poison, but he quickly added, "Of course, I am only here as a guest." The first hints of a puzzle. After the inspector retired to consult with the coroner, Miss Marple took her morning stroll in the hotel gardens. They were extensive, with gravelled walks winding between herbaceous borders, a lily pond glistening in the sun, and at the far end, a small pavilion overlooking the spring from which the Grange drew its famed waters. She paused by the pavilion, noting with interest a row of glass carafes filled with the mineral water, neatly corked and labelled. A maid approached with a tray to replenish the supply. Miss Marple asked a few gentle questions. "Oh yes, ma'am," said the maid. "The guests take the waters daily. It's said to keep one young and fresh. Mr. Ashworth insists upon it." "And Mr. Wells, did he partake regularly?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. "Indeed he did, ma'am. Never missed his morning glass." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly upon her parasol. Water was easily tampered with, so, too, was food. And both were shared communally, which meant the intended victim must have been singled out in some other way. A private conversation that afternoon. Mrs. Price confided in Miss Marple. "Jane, I feel so unsettled. I cannot rid myself of the impression that Mr. Wells was troubled. He told me once, in confidence, that he had stumbled upon something peculiar in his research. He was a historian, specializing in alchemical manuscripts. He hinted that it concerned rejuvenation. Of all things! I laughed, of course, but he looked at me so gravely." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. "How curious," she murmured. "Rejuvenation, you say? A theme most consistent with this establishment." Mrs. Price lowered her voice. "The truth is, Jane, I came here because I was exhausted and nervous. But since arriving, I truly do feel younger, stronger. My color has returned, my aches are lessened. It is remarkable. And yet," she broke off, shivering, "and yet I wonder if there is some price to be paid." Observation at tea later that day. Miss Marple sat in the lounge during afternoon tea, her embroidery hoop balanced lightly in her hands. She watched as Lady Cynthia and Dr. Blackwood conversed in low tones by the fireplace. Colonel Arbuthnot read the newspaper but kept casting glances at them. Mr. Ashworth moved quietly among the guests, his smile fixed, his eyes ever watchful. The tea service was brought in delicate china cups, plates of scones and seed cake, and silver pots of steaming Darjeeling. Miss Marple noticed that Mr. Ashworth personally poured for Lady Cynthia and Dr. Blackwood, while the maid attended to the others. An unusual attention, she thought. She herself sipped only sparingly, but she watched with quiet eyes. The ritual of tea, she knew well, was a perfect opportunity for either kindness or malice. An unsettling discovery the following morning. While strolling near the spring, Miss Marple happened upon something most peculiar. Behind the pavilion, half hidden in the ivy, was a small locked cupboard. From within came a faint odor, sharp, chemical, not at all like the wholesome scent of herbs or minerals. She bent to examine it, but before she could linger, Mr. Ashworth appeared suddenly on the path. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said smoothly, "admiring our waters. They are the pride of the Grange. Quite restorative." His tone was genial, but his eyes flickered with a trace of unease. He guided her firmly back towards the gardens, talking of roses and daffodils, yet Miss Marple felt with certainty that he had intercepted her deliberately. Suspicion widens that evening. After supper, Inspector Graves called upon Miss Marple. He had heard from Mrs. Price that she possessed a keen faculty for observation, and though sceptical of amateur interference, he was pragmatic enough to welcome any insight. "Between ourselves, madam," he said, lowering his voice, "I am not satisfied with the heart failure explanation. The coroner found traces that suggest something ingested, yet we cannot prove how, nor who. Everyone dined together, drank the same wine, ate the same food." Miss Marple folded her hands serenely. "Perhaps not quite the same, Inspector. It is so often a matter of the smallest difference. A cup taken from the left of the tray instead of the right. A carafe poured into one glass and not another. I have observed, in village life, how frequently the fate of a person may turn upon such trifles." Graves looked at her with grudging respect. "You may be right, ma'am, and I believe our victim suspected something himself. Among his effects, we found a notebook filled with curious jottings, references to youth, age, and a certain formula. I cannot make head or tail of it." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Then perhaps, Inspector, we must ask ourselves not who disliked Mr. Wells, but who feared what he knew." Closing of Act 2. The guests retired uneasily that night, yet beneath the quiet of the old manor, currents of fear and suspicion ran strong. Colonel Arbuthnot locked his door. Lady Cynthia requested hot milk to calm her nerves. Dr. Blackwood paced the corridor long after midnight, and in her modest room overlooking the gardens, Miss Marple sat by the lamplight, her knitting needles flashing steadily. Her mind worked as steadily as her hands, sorting through motives, habits, and opportunities. A man who studied alchemy, a hotel that promised rejuvenation, guests who appeared to grow younger, and a manager who guarded his spring so carefully. Patterns repeat themselves, she murmured softly, just as in Set Mary Mead, only here the stakes are rather higher. The stage was set. The first questions had been asked, and Miss Marple knew that somewhere within the genteel company of the Grange retreat there lay a murderer. One who had struck once, and might strike again. The atmosphere at the Grange retreat grew heavier with each passing day. What had been promoted as a sanctuary of rest and renewal now felt more like a theatre in which suspicion and unease played the leading roles. The guests, once united in their admiration for the establishment, now regarded one another with sidelong glances, their conversations brittle, their laughter forced. Miss Marple, sitting unobtrusively in her customary corner of the lounge, appeared every inch the placid spinster content with her knitting. But behind the steady clack of her needles, her mind turned ceaselessly, weaving connections as intricate as the stitches in her lace. An unexpected visit. Inspector Graves returned the following afternoon with further news. He had pursued inquiries in London regarding Edmund Wells. "It seems," he said, lowering his voice as he and Miss Marple walked slowly along the gravelled path, "that Mr. Wells had been working on a manuscript, something quite out of the ordinary, a study of ancient alchemical practices, and in particular, the myth of reversed aging, youth restored to the old, the clock wound backwards, so to speak. His publisher claims he had uncovered references in several obscure texts, though no one is quite sure how far he had taken it." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the daffodils nodding in the breeze. "And if such a discovery were more than mere fancy, Inspector, it might tempt the wrong kind of interest." Graves grunted. "Precisely, and I am told he had recently quarrelled with someone here, though the publisher wouldn't say whom." At that moment, Lady Cynthia Harwood emerged from the French doors of the lounge, her silk shawl fluttering, her face pale but composed. She paused when she saw them, offered a brittle smile, and glided past towards the rose garden. Miss Marple followed her retreating figure with quiet thought. The Colonel's confession. That evening, as the guests gathered for dinner, Colonel Arbuthnot contrived to sit beside Miss Marple. His usual bluff manner was subdued. "Confounded business, this," he muttered, lowering his voice. "Can't abide the way everyone's eyeing each other. Look here, Miss Marple, you're a sensible woman. Perhaps I ought to tell you, better out than festering inside me." Miss Marple inclined her head with gentle encouragement. "I knew Wells before, you see," he said, his moustache twitching nervously. "Years ago in India. Fellow was digging into some blasted old manuscripts there. We had a bit of a quarrel, over a lady, nothing serious, but lately he hinted at knowing something about me I'd rather not come out. Dashed embarrassing. Not criminal, mind you, but still." Miss Marple patted his hand kindly. "Secrets, Colonel, have a way of weighing heavily on us, but not every quarrel ends in tragedy." Still, she made note of his words. A motive, however small, was a motive nonetheless. Dr. Blackwood's midnight walk later that night, restless from the tension that seemed to pervade the very air. Miss Marple sat by her window overlooking the garden. The moon hung low, casting silver shadows across the lawns. As the hour neared midnight, she observed movement, a tall figure slipping quietly from the house. The outline was unmistakable. Lionel Blackwood. He moved swiftly down the path towards the spring pavilion. Curious, Miss Marple waited. Half an hour passed before he returned, carrying something small and wrapped in a cloth. He glanced about furtively before re-entering the house. Miss Marple's needles clicked in the dim light. So, the good doctor has secrets of his own. Lady Cynthia's letter. The following morning, a chambermaid confided nervously to Miss Marple. She had found a torn scrap of paper in Lady Cynthia's waste bin. Miss Marple smoothed the fragment carefully. It bore only a few words, scrawled in a hurried hand. Cannot allow Wells to publish. Dangerous. Must be stopped. The signature was missing. Yet the implication was clear enough. Miss Marple tucked the fragment discreetly into her knitting bag. Later, Lady Cynthia appeared unusually agitated, snapping at the maid, then apologizing in a flutter. Forgive me, nerves, my dear. This place, once so peaceful, now feels like a prison. Miss Marple's mild eyes rested on her with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. The second shock that evening, just as supper was served, another commotion arose. Mrs. Lavinia Price, Miss Marple's old acquaintance, let out a strangled cry and dropped her glass of water. Her face contorted, and for a dreadful moment all feared another collapse. But with effort, she steadied herself. I felt suddenly faint, she gasped. A most peculiar taste in the water. The doctor rushed to her side, examining her pulse. Exhaustion, perhaps, he said briskly, yet Miss Marple noticed how his eyes flickered nervously to the carafe. Inspector Graves, hastily summoned, tasted a drop from the glass and spat it out at once. Bitter, very bitter. The contents were taken for analysis. Suspicion thickened like fog. If Mrs. Price had indeed been poisoned, then the murderer had struck again, though this time unsuccessfully. Miss Marple makes her rounds. Over the next 2 days, Miss Marple took it upon herself to visit each guest under the guise of friendly conversation. With Colonel Arbuthnot, she listened to his tales of India, gently guiding him back to his acquaintance with Wells. He admitted grudgingly that Wells had threatened to reveal certain indiscretions, though he swore he had no wish to silence him permanently. With Lady Cynthia she spoke of society days long past. Lady Cynthia, after some hesitation, confessed that Wells had once courted her, years ago. Tedious man, she declared, though her trembling hands betrayed stronger feelings. He wrote to me not long ago. Threatened to reveal our old correspondence. Imagine the scandal. Dr. Blackwood was the most evasive. When Miss Marple casually mentioned seeing him in the gardens, his expression hardened. A touch of insomnia, he said curtly. Fresh air does one good, nothing more. Yet his manner was not that of a man at ease, and Mr. Ashworth, always the polished host, always attentive, but Miss Marple noticed the tiniest crack in his composure whenever the spring or the waters were mentioned. The pride of the Grange, he would say, his smile fixed. Yet his eyes betrayed unease. The false lid. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, grew convinced that Colonel Arbuthnot was the guilty party. The Colonel's quarrel with Wells, his nervous manner, and his access to the wine that night all pointed, in the inspector's eyes, to guilt. Miss Marple, however, was not persuaded. The Colonel may bluster, Inspector, she said gently, but bluster rarely conceals cunning. I should look rather to those who prefer shadows to noise. The suspicion spread. The Colonel grew defensive, snapping at the others, and the harmony of the guests deteriorated further. By the week's end, the atmosphere at the Grange had become intolerable. Guests whispered of leaving, though Ashworth urged them to remain. The analysis of the water was due any day, and all waited in anxious suspense. Miss Marple, sitting serenely by the fire with her knitting, knew the time was drawing near. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Wells's research, the rejuvenated guests, the guarded spring, the strange midnight walks. Yet still, one question lingered. Was the miracle of youth at the Grange a natural wonder, or a dangerous deception? And who among the genteel company had killed to keep it secret? The guests of the Grange retreat had begun to avoid one another's eyes. The once convivial lounge, with its polished mahogany and firelit comfort, was now a chamber of suspicion. Every rustle of the newspaper, every clink of the teacup seemed laden with meaning. Even the ticking of the long-case clock in the hall sounded louder, as though marking the time until the murderer was revealed. Miss Marple, with her customary modesty, remained unobtrusive. She knitted quietly, asked seemingly trivial questions, and sat in her corner as if she were part of the furniture. But her eyes never ceased their gentle watching. The inspector's frustration. Inspector Graves returned with the results of the analysis of Mrs. Price's water glass. There's no doubt about it, he said grimly. Traces of digitalis, strong enough to cause real harm, if more had been taken. The inspector, wary and exasperated, rubbed his brow. We know it's poison. We know it's deliberate. But blast it, we can't prove who administered it. Everyone had access to the water. Miss Marple looked at him mildly. But not everyone has the same habit of pouring, Inspector. A little thing, quite easily overlooked. You see, I have observed that some guests pour their own glass, while others always wait to be served. Mr. Wells, for example, was most particular that his water came from the carafe nearest him. A small preference, perhaps, but preferences are where the devil hides. Graves frowned. You think someone counted on his habits? Quite so, said Miss Marple gently. The notebook that evening. Graves produced Edmund Wells's notebook. The coroner had returned it after the post-mortem. Its pages were dense with notes, citations, and obscure Latin quotations. One passage in particular had been underlined twice. That which reverses time's arrow lies not in the body but in the tincture. Beware the draught that sweetens youth, for it may sour into death. Miss Marple read it thoughtfully. Mr. Wells was closer to the truth than he realized. He suspected that the so-called miracle here was not natural at all, but chemical. She turned to Graves. Inspector, have you noticed how radiant the guests appear? Color in the cheeks, brightness in the eyes, a youthful spring in the step. Yet there is also a fragility beneath it, a brittleness, like a candle that burns too brightly. Graves muttered. Are you saying Ashworth's famous waters are doctored? Miss Marple gave a small smile. Not I, Inspector. Mr. Wells said so himself, in his own way. The manager's secret that night. Miss Marple feigned fatigue earlier than usual, retiring to her room. But once the corridor was quiet, she wrapped a shawl about her shoulders and slipped silently downstairs. The spring pavilion drew her once more, its dark outline looming beneath the moonlight. She approached cautiously. The locked cupboard behind the ivy caught her eye again. Producing a small crochet hook, an innocent tool to any casual observer, she worked deftly at the lock. Within were rows of small vials, each carefully labeled, filled with a clear liquid. The odor was unmistakable, bitter, chemical, medicinal. Miss Marple lifted one, holding it up in the moonlight. She did not need scientific knowledge to know what it meant. The waters had been tampered with. A rustle behind her made her turn. Mr. Felix Ashworth stood in the shadows, his face white, his eyes cold. Miss Marple, he said softly, you should not be here. For a long moment, they faced each other, the night air sharp and still. Then he forced a smile. These are merely supplements, tonics, entirely harmless. Our guests expect results after all. Miss Marple's voice was calm. Supplements that, when improperly measured, may act as poison. Mr. Wells discovered your secret, and for that, he paid with his life. Ashworth's smile did not falter, but his hand trembled ever so slightly. You are a most perceptive lady, but surely you cannot prove such a thing. Perhaps not yet, Miss Marple said gently. But proof has a way of presenting itself, given patience. Turning the spotlight the following morning, Miss Marple requested that Inspector Graves gather all the guests in the lounge. The fire burned brightly, the curtains drawn against the grey drizzle outside. Tension vibrated in the air as the assembled company took their seats. Miss Marple rose slowly, leaning lightly on her cane. She spoke in her soft, measured tones, each word clear. It is time, I think, that we look plainly at what has occurred. Mr. Wells did not die of natural causes. He was poisoned. The attempt upon Mrs. Price confirms it. And the source of this poison lies not in the food or wine, but in the very waters we have been told are so restorative. A murmur ran through the room. Lady Cynthia gasped, her hand flying to her throat. The colonel muttered an oath. Dr. Blackwood's eyes glittered, though he said nothing. Miss Marple continued. The truth is that the Grange has achieved its reputation not by miracle, but by chemistry. Small doses of a certain compound can indeed produce the illusion of youth, flushed cheeks, sharpened energy. But the line between tonic and toxin is perilously thin. Mr. Wells, in his studies, realized this. He threatened exposure. And so he was silenced. Her eyes moved to Mr. Ashworth, who stood stiffly by the mantel. His face betrayed nothing, yet the room seemed to hold its breath. But, Miss Marple added, her gaze shifting, Mr. Ashworth is not the only one with a stake in the matter. Others, too, had reasons to fear Mr. Wells. Letters that might revive old scandals, secrets from India, a past courtship best forgotten. Yet none of these motives carried the same weight as protecting the very foundation of this establishment. Inspector Graves stepped forward. Were you saying it was Ashworth, then? Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she resumed her seat. I am saying, Inspector, that the true culprit is among us. And though appearances may mislead, habits never do. It was Wells's own habit, his insistence on pouring from the carafe nearest him, that allowed the poisoner's hand to be revealed. The guests shifted uneasily. Colonel Arbuthnot swore under his breath. Lady Cynthia looked on the verge of fainting. Miss Marple's eyes were bright with quiet certainty. The poisoned water was not poured at random. It was prepared for Wells in particular. Only one person ensured he always drank it, and that person will be revealed soon, Her words hung in the air like a spell. Inspector Graves, though still sceptical, could not disguise his anticipation. "And you will name that person, Miss Marple?" "Not yet," she said serenely. "But very soon. The truth is already here, hidden in the smallest of observations. We need only uncover it." The company dispersed in uneasy silence, each suspect withdrawing into their own thoughts, and Miss Marple, calm and steadfast, sat once more by the fire, her knitting steady in her lap. The pattern was clear now. The threads were all in her hands. The time for revelation was at hand. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke. Rain lashed against the tall windows of the Granger's lounge, the branches of the cedar trees bending in the wind. Within, the fire crackled, and the guests assembled once more under Inspector Graves's stern summons. They sat in a tense semicircle, Lady Cynthia pale and trembling, Colonel Arbuthnot scowling, Dr. Blackwood with a sheen of cold curiosity in his eyes, Miss Price fanning herself nervously, and Felix Ashworth, calm, but with the faintest shadow darkening his handsome features, and, in her customary seat near the hearth, sat Miss Marple, knitting needles clicking gently. The gathering Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "Miss Marple has been of great assistance in this matter. She believes she can now tell us who murdered Edmund Wells. Miss Marple, if you please." The old lady folded her knitting neatly on her lap. She rose with difficulty, leaning on her cane, and her mild blue eyes swept the room. "I fear this has been a most unpleasant business," she began softly. "A gentleman poisoned, another lady narrowly escaping the same fate. Yet, unpleasant though it is, truth must be spoken." A shiver of unease passed through the company. The web of motives Miss Marple's voice, though quiet, carried to every corner. Mr. Wells was, by all accounts, a studious and rather observant man. He spent his days writing, reading, making his little notes. But in so doing, he uncovered rather too much. He learned that the miraculous rejuvenation offered here, at the Grange, was not due to mineral springs or mountain air, but to carefully administered doses of a chemical compound. That discovery alone was dangerous. It threatened the reputation of this establishment. But Mr. Wells also had letters in his possession, letters capable of reopening old scandals and secrets long buried. She looked at Lady Cynthia. The color drained from the woman's cheeks. "You feared exposure of your past connection with Wells, did you not? A youthful indiscretion, a foolish attachment. But, no, such motives are rarely strong enough to lead to murder." Lady Cynthia let out a strangled protest but said no more. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Colonel Arbuthnot. "You, too, had cause to dislike Wells. He knew something of your conduct in India. But again, dislike does not always equal murder." The colonel muttered something about "damned impertinence," but his voice was hollow. "Dag Blackwood." Miss Marple continued, "Your interest lay more in science than scandal. Wells's notes threatened to expose the truth about the so-called waters. Yet, as a man of medicine, you might have been more inclined to seize upon his findings than to silence them. And as for Mrs. Price, well, she too was poisoned, and so cannot be the culprit." Her eyes turned finally to Felix Ashworth. "Which brings us to you, Mr. Ashworth. As manager of the Grange, your entire livelihood depended on the secrecy of those vials hidden in the pavilion cupboard. Wells's discovery imperiled everything. Yet," she paused delicately, "there is one fact that rules you out." The fatal habit. A murmur swept the room. Ashworth's composure faltered. Miss Marple's voice sharpened ever so slightly. "You see, Mr. Ashworth rarely poured Mr. Wells's water. In fact, Wells himself was insistent on pouring from whichever carafe sat nearest him. The poison was placed in that carafe, which means it had to be someone seated close enough to anticipate his habit." Inspector Graves leaned forward. "Go on, Miss Marple." She nodded. "At dinner, it was Dr. Blackwood who sat nearest Wells. Yet the night he died, it was Colonel Arbuthnot who had changed seats, insisting on being near the fire because of a draught, and it was Colonel Arbuthnot who poured water first, before Wells helped himself. The Colonel is a man of action, accustomed to quick decisions. When he realized Wells might expose his disgrace in India, he acted swiftly. But, alas, he miscalculated the dose." The room went deathly still. The Colonel unmasked. Colonel Arbuthnot's ruddy face turned ashen. He surged to his feet, fists clenched. "Damn nonsense!" he roared. "You've no proof. No proof at all." Miss Marple's eyes were steady. "But we have, Colonel. The decanter you handled bore traces of your cigar ash on its stopper, and only you smoked those particular cheroots. Inspector Graves had it tested. That was the final confirmation." Graves stepped forward, holding up a small envelope. "She's right. We matched the ash. It was Arbuthnot's hand that tampered with Wells's water. The colonel's bluster collapsed. He sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping, the fight draining from him. "He'd have ruined me," he muttered hoarsely. "All those years of service, honor, gone, because of some damned scribbler's notes. I only meant to frighten him, just a small dose. Didn't think it would kill so quickly." His voice trailed into silence. The aftermath. Inspector Graves gave a sharp order. 2 constables, waiting outside, entered and took the colonel into custody. The guests sat in stunned silence, the crackle of the fire filling the void. Felix Ashworth looked pale but relieved. "It seems I owe you a debt, Miss Marple, though perhaps my own practices here require a re-examination." Miss Marple gave him a mild look. "Indeed, Mr. Ashworth, playing with dangerous compounds is never wise. Truth, you see, has a habit of surfacing. Best not to tempt it." Lady Cynthia dabbed at her eyes. Mrs. Price muttered about never drinking the water again. Dr. Blackwood scribbled furiously in a notebook, already thinking of medical implications, and Miss Marple, she resumed her knitting, her expression serene. A quiet reflection later that evening, as the rain eased and the house settled into uneasy quiet, Inspector Graves found Miss Marple by the fire. "You did it again, ma'am," he said with grudging admiration. "Saw what the rest of us missed." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is only a matter of observing the little things, Inspector. A habit of pouring, a trace of cigar ash, a word spoken too quickly. People are very much alike everywhere, whether in a village or a country house. Human nature, I always say, is the same the world over." She folded her knitting away, her needles finally at rest. "And, of course, one must remember, murder, however cleverly concealed, will out, always." The fire flickered low, shadows dancing on the walls. Outside the storm passed, leaving the air cool and clear. And so, with the murderer revealed and the mystery of the cursed knitting needle resolved, Miss Marple prepared to return to her quiet village life, where roses grew, gossip thrived, and truth was always waiting to be discovered by those with eyes to see.